South Africa has been racking up debt at quite a pace, largely due to poor economic growth and low tax revenues. Servicing this debt is the biggest cost item on the budget.
The weak performance of our economy has resulted in sharp deterioration in tax revenue collection for 23-24. At 1.73 trillion, tax revenue for 23-24 is 56.1 billion lower than estimated in the 2023 budget. The shortfall is largely due to the decline in corporate profits and revenue for taxes on mining.
The minister said debt will peak in the next financial year and tax revenue is projected to improve. The Treasury's gold and foreign exchange contingency reserve account also made strong gains due to rand weakness. The Treasury will use around $8 billion from the reserve to reduce some of its debt.
The national government gross borrowing requirement will decline from 457.7 billion in 2024 to an estimated 4.5% of GDP, reaching 3.3% by 26-27. Debt will now peak at 75.3% of GDP in 25-26. All of this puts us in a position to continue to protect core services.
Drinkers and smokers will have to cough up more for their pleasures. Those who vape will get the biggest hit as the excise duty jumps by 3 rand per milliliter of nicotine. On the environmental side, increases on carbon tax and the carbon fuel levy were announced. There was some good news for electric vehicle production. Government is introducing an allowance for new investments. This will allow producers to claim 150% of qualifying investment spending on electrical and hydrogen-powered vehicles in the first year. This was a rather lackluster budget. There were very few surprises, and some economists said that it also lacked muscle. The finance minister didn't give enough detail as to how he was going to lift growth, lift revenue, and tackle this rising debt. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Cape Town, South Africa.
Right then, so let's explore exactly what this budget implies for households and businesses alike. Chris Hatting is the Executive Director at the Centre for Risk Analysis. He's joining us now live on the programme. Chris, good to see you tonight. So let's start with that plan that the Finance Minister announced, drawing down $8 billion from the gold and foreign exchange contingency reserve account while also reforming how that account is used. How will these changes exactly help the state to cut its borrowing needs, at least in the short run?
Good evening, and thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss this very interesting budget in an election year, of course, in South Africa. On those unrealized gains, I think it helps government a little bit to narrow the gap between revenue and expenditure and deal with the ever-growing debt servicing costs. But in the long term, I feel this sort of kicks the can down the road. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're addressing the root causes of your higher debt trajectory. So you might give yourself some temporary relief over the next year or two, maybe the next 3 years at most. But I'm waiting to see on the details around how will it exactly be used, what changes will be introduced around the accounts themselves to maybe make them easier to tap in the future. It feels a bit like a get out of jail free card in a way, but usually with economics and fiscal budgets and that sort of thing, that rule doesn't apply. So we'll need to see how that money is used specifically, if it is just for debt relief, but also over the long term, what changes are made to either make it easier to tap those accounts or not.
Indeed, it almost feels like you're tapping into seed corn in some respects. But I'm trying to get my head around the mechanics of it, right? Because the gains in the contingency reserve account essentially are unrealized. So if you're essentially going to get the money, you have to sell some of the underlying assets. So do we have any idea exactly how this would work? What essentially would have to be sold off or cashed in for the government to now turn around and say, yeah, okay, now we can draw down this $8 billion?
No, exactly. It becomes a very onerous and complicated process to see exactly how you would then see that materialize in the sort of funds that the Treasury or other government departments would then use. So we're going to see, hopefully in the next few days, maybe in the next month at the longest, where are the processes? Is it a 10-step process? Is it a 2-step process? All that sort of thing. But to try and realize these unrealized gains and to use them for that, again, as I mentioned, the narrowing of the gap between expenditure and revenue, you wonder if this was the best potential route to follow, especially if it means sending a signal around, is South Africa desperately scrambling for certain relief in terms of its debt? What is it willing to do? What is it willing to not rule out? It maybe raises questions around that sort of thing as well.
Indeed, and some perhaps will read this as fiscal slippage because regardless, the fiscal deficit is going from 4% to 4.9%. But I want to go back to something else that he actually mentioned in the budget speech. He penciled in third-party access to the freight rail network that Transnet runs from the month of May. From where you stand, though, would that be a significant effort to fix the bottlenecks that we've seen plaguing the ports and the rail system over the last year?
I think there's definitely potential for some positive change, but that's also given what a low point the operations of the ports and the country's rail networks have reached, where throughout the last 2 years, South African mining companies have struggled to get their goods out, South African farmers. That, of course, impacts negatively on tax revenue because even though there's still global demand for South African commodities, we can't get our materials, our commodities, our goods out as much as we did beforehand. So the biggest example of this proposed opening up is in Durban, at Durban Harbour at Pier 2, in sort of an agreement with a company based in the Philippines. We still need to see all the minute details around it. There have been some reports that there could be some pushback from labor unions around how this will be structured. Will their jobs be secure? All that sort of thing. But the idea thereof gives one hope because at least there'll be an element of more competition where there hasn't been up until this point. So maybe that'll spur the state-owned company Transnet to just get some of its operations and its own fiscal house in order. Speaking of Transnet, it was given 47 billion rand of a credit facility by National Treasury. We'll see what the terms and conditions are of that. But overall, this process of opening up to third-party access could send the right signal for bringing in private sector expertise, capital, skills sharing, technology. We'll just need to see if that actually materializes. And again, given that it's an election year, that might be a very difficult sort of line for the government and Transnet to deal with.
I want to go back to something that you said in a note that I believe was published on CRA's website in January. And I'm just paraphrasing your argument here. And at the time you said, look, even if Transnet gets a bit of extra cash, you get a bit of debt guarantees, and they've certainly gotten that in the budget, $2.5 billion, 47 billion rand. And they essentially they're given an opportunity to open up the network to third-party users. This still doesn't sort out the fundamental mismanagement problems that essentially got the company here to the first place. Is that an argument you still stand by, given everything that we've heard in the budget statement today?
I'm in complete agreement on that particular point. The sort of debt relief that has been provided to not just Transnet, but other SOEs over the years, South African Airways as a big example, Eskom, of course, they don't come with stringent enough requirements to implement reforms at those SOEs, but also the wider policy and legislative space where you need to ask what conditions were in place for these SOEs to reach the perilous point at which they are, where they act effectively as a hard cap on South Africa's economic growth potential, on job creation, on investment. If these forms of debt relief, bailouts, I guess the terminology can become quite diplomatic. If you don't impose quite stringent conditions and you continue providing relief either in big batches or small sort of drip feed ways, you perhaps in a way just encourage the same behavior. You might have different boards, you might have different ministers in the different departments, but that doesn't mean that the underlying policy, operational, fiscal issues are resolved. So this gives Transnet some measure of breathing room, but as they always say, the proof is in the pudding. So we need to see if they use this now to really spur change in South Africa's logistics space.
Indeed. One last question for you. So the Finance Minister also announced increases in the carbon fuel levy, effective, I believe, from 3rd of April. And early in the year, the carbon tax also went up by nearly 20% to around $10 a tonne. But how exactly do these work? How are these taxes helping to pay, if they are paying at all, for the country's transition to more renewables?
The country might try and implement a similar route to what Europe is trying to do with the CBAM and how they implement sort of carbon taxes, and if they'll provide carbon credits, if manufacturers and companies, in this case in automobiles, sort of reform their supply chains, their manufacturing, if they start producing more electric vehicles, that kind of thing. In terms of the minutiae of how that sort of thing would be measured and collected. But a big thing in South Africa, at least since around 2008, 2009, has been the difference between rhetoric that we are provided with from politicians of sort of all stripes versus actual implementation and action. So you can talk about implementing this, but will there be the capacity in entities like the Department of Transport, the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition, and others to enforce this kind of thing, or to have that back and forth with industry to ensure that it is implemented in the best way possible for the automobile industry locally, and to spur further job creation and investment over the long term, not just for the short term. So we'll need to see if that mismatch that has persisted over the last, I think, at least 10 years is going to be reversed somewhat.